church bells in the background. They've just finished, all 5 of them. It's 5 p.m. The bells for me tell the time. Sometimes they're a nuisance, but telling the time is useful. I don't wear a watch. I have my cell phone, and I only go to it for, well, I won't say only, but usually for other kinds of information. In any case, yesterday we spoke about 2 presidents, George Herbert Walker Bush and William Jefferson Clinton, their involvement in the gradual evolution of American empire. So today I want to continue with this evolution. If you call it evolution, let's say progression. Progressive, progression kind of go together, don't they? So I want to continue with the progression of American empire, the building of the first global empire in world history. There have been some other empires that have also been very large. The Roman Empire was quite large. The Greek Empire was quite large. The Japanese Empire was quite large. The Germany's empire was not exactly small. And the Spanish Empire was extremely large. There was the French Empire. I mean, this is empire, empire, empire. There's so many others. And we're led to believe that empire is, or it has to happen. It's just part of who we are. And I believe strongly that's a misnomer. I mean, war will occur because people in the state take offense to what other people do. They take it personally, and then they rally the nation behind them, and they militarize and they attack. It's a matter of human pride. All right, so war does occur, but usually there are other motivations for it. It's not just the pride of the leader and the pride of the nation. Someone is making money. Someone is working behind the scenes. Book by a fellow named what is his name? I've read it so long ago, but the name of the book is War is a Racket, and it was written by former general in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War I. And Smedley Butler, that's his name, Smedley Butler. And the book is very short, and it's well worth your read because it will show you what happened in certain firms, how their profit margins rose tremendously during World War I. And these people are, of course, interested in making profit. And they have no scruples. Their goal is to make profit. Their goal is to provide for their families. Their goal is to enhance their own position in society. And morals are sacrificed. The group comes together in a corporate board, and morals are thrown out the window. Profit becomes number one. Now, believe me, I have nothing against profit making, but I do have a lot against immoral profit making, and war is made for profit is immoral. It's just wrong, and there's no reason why we as a people should have to tolerate it. But we're not alert to it. We listen to the national propaganda, and the national propaganda is, of course, supported behind the scenes by these commercial warlords. And these are our enemy, and these are they're part of the enemy within. And that is what we've got to look at. That is what we've got to examine. I mean, private corporations are private, and therefore they engage in a lot that we don't know about as a public. But the government is not private. The government is public. And what goes behind the scenes in government should be known to the people. maybe not as soon as it occurs, but well within time to counteract the misdeeds that are engaged in by government officials and corporate owners. So the problem lies in government. It's not private business. I mean, there are immoral people everywhere. There are immoral people that operations. Immorality is a problem in society. We kind of tossed out the one institution that we had to guard against immorality, and that was the church. It's just not popular. But that doesn't mean we can't be moral people. And that doesn't mean that we can't teach basic principles, so very basic moral principles that don't rely on religious institutions to force necessarily, but certainly to encourage. And that's one of the big reasons I'm not against religion. I think religion plays a very important role in society. I myself am not religious in that sense, but obviously I wouldn't be here today in this hunger strike if I weren't a moral person. Well, where did I get that morality? I got that morality from my parents. And I went to church. I was confirmed when I was 15 years old. And that the morality that's inside me came from the church. Since then, I've studied the church. I've studied the Christian faith, and I've realized that and I didn't just study the Christian faith. I mean, I lived in Japan, which is Buddhist, Christian, and Shinto, all at the same time. I don't want to go into that now. That's an entire another issue. That is Japan. So let's put that aside. But I lived in Japan for 9 years. I lived in Hong Kong for 7 years. Now Hong Kong is partly Buddhist, and from there I moved to not directly, indirectly to Thailand, which is completely Buddhist. So that's 8 years of Buddhism, plus 9 years of Shintoism, Buddhism, and Christianity mixed together, plus 20 plus years of Christianity. And then I decided, well, all right, I've seen how these two major world religions work. Why don't I try a third? And I went to Saudi Arabia, which is probably, at least in my mind, it was the heart of the Muslim world, because it's the defender of the two holy shrines of Muslim. Makkah and Medina. So I've had a good taste of all three religions, and I've seen how they work their way through into social behavior and social speech. But I, as an anthropologist, trained at the University of Michigan, society from an evolutionary point of view, a social evolutionary point of view, a biological evolutionary point of view. And I'm quite convinced that the story of evolution is correct, that God does not exist. And I don't want to get into that issue, but I just have very strong feelings that the product of humankind and not the other way around. But moral behavior is very important. And without moral behavior, society, and I'm not talking about moral behavior dictated to us by government. No. I'm talking about moral behavior that is learned in the family, that is learned in the community. And this is what keeps us in check. There's a very interesting part of Western civilization that might be of interest to you, and it's provided by Hillsdale College in Michigan. They have an interesting lecture series on Athens and Sparta, ancient Greek states. And they contrast the two cultures, which actually live very close together, but were geographically separated by mountains and sea. But what you find out is that the Spartans were very much like the Japanese. They're a shame culture. And the Athenians were more like Western civilization is today, moralistic culture. In other words, we're taught to selves morality, where in the shame culture, morality is embedded into the society itself, not necessarily into the individual. And when a person is taken out of that shame culture, he tends to behave very differently than when he's in his own culture. I noticed that myself, meeting people, having lived in their countries and then meeting them outside of their countries, I can compare their behavior. A Korean living in Japan from Korea is not going to behave like he would when he's in Korea. A Korean living in Japan, was born there, part of Japanese society, behaves very much like a Japanese and very different from a Korean who's lived his whole life in Korea. That's just only one example. There are many more. Today, we're going to continue the discussion about politics, but maybe with a religious overtone. Get started. That was kind of like a preface to what I want to talk about. I wanted to return to my own cause, which is against the spoil system and against involuntary charity, and just make a point about my current situation and speak a little bit about how I've gotten to where I am. First of all, I want to show you this. I'm not sure to what degree you can see it, but it's my eviction notice. I showed it before. Just want to show it again. And the reason I want to show it is because I want you to listen to the reply that I sent to the attorney that delivered it to me personally. And I was asked to respond to this notice by August 19th. I received it on Friday, and I immediately composed a letter, and it was sent on Monday. So that was on the 15th. So I'm sure that they'll. And what I wrote to them is this: as there is still some chance, namely this protest, that I will have the money that is rightfully due my landlord, not me. Notice that. Before you initiate the eviction proceedings. All right. So as there is still some chance that I will have the money that is rightfully due my landlord, initiate the eviction proceedings. I'm writing to the lawyer, to the attorney. I request my landlord's further patience. In other words, I'm asking the attorney to speak with the landlord to see if he wouldn't be a little more patient before he begins legal proceedings. Or at a minimum, that you recognize my desire to meet with you in court. Now, I don't know what state I'll be in, but at least maybe if the money arrives, I will have a chance, and I've recovered, I'll have a chance to go to court and resolve this problem with no damage to my credit rating. And that's my hope. And then I further say, I'm a good tenant who is run into financial difficulty, nothing more, nothing less. And the proof that I'm a good tenant is on the webpage, www.nudge.online. It's there. There's a lot of evidence there, in fact. And if you want to verify that I am really who I am, it's a letter from my apartment manager that speaks very nice things about me. And then I close. Thank you for your understanding, and sign it. So that is where I stand as far as my current residence is concerned, and the biggest threat to my credit rating. Then I've also did a little bit of investigation about hunger striking. I've been on this path for 5 days now. Just in a couple of hours, we'll begin the 6th day. And I kind of went into it blindly because I knew that some time and still finish me off, bring it to an end. So I'm not forced to become, so that I'm not forced to succumb to the system and become some sort of petty thief. That's what American society has become because of the spoil system, and I don't want to participate in it in that form, in that manner. So long as I don't have to become a thief, I'm willing to fight against the system and live what I would call a clean life. And being the moral person that I am, this has been the outcome. But because of my investigation, and you can find it on my webpage, I purchased two things: vitamins, something called Centrum, with iron and calcium fortification. What this will do is it will preserve my body while my muscle is being destroyed. Hunger means that, well, the body, in order to preserve itself, has to have nourishment, and it gets its nourishment from the existing flesh. So what the hunger strike is about is or what the hunger, not the hunger strike, but the hunger that the hunger strike brings about. What it's about is it's a gradual erosion of flesh. It's a destruction of the human body. But the vitamins keep the physiology in good order, protects my immune system so that I'm not susceptible to disease while I become weaker and weaker. And I don't know exactly how weak I can become. I think I can become very weak and still survive. And my mental condition is pretty good. I mean, I'm satisfied. I catch my own errors when I write, when I tweet, before I send them. And while I'm speaking, my memory seems to be working pretty good. Well, it's up to you to judge. Because this is extemporaneous, it's not a prepared speech. It's more like a talk, kind of a monologue, which is unfortunate because I'm most effective when I'm speaking for an audience with looking at facial expressions and actually communicating with people. This is a completely different experience for me, so I'm not used to it. And, well, please bear with me. The other thing I bought is baking soda. And the baking soda has electrolytes in it. Electrolytes are supposed to prevent dehydration. And it also puts a form of salt into my system. I don't know what that does medically, but I do know that salt is very important to maintain stamina and to maintain a strong will, if you like. Salt, I know that the Israelis eliminated salt from the diets of their prisoners, their Palestinian prisoners, while they're in prison, in order to weaken them. And I've also read that this was done in China. I don't know if it was done in Japan. I don't know if it has been done in the United States, but it reduces your spirit. It weakens your spirit because maybe a lower blood pressure. I'm not sure how it works, but it is a technique to subdue the imprisoned. Then finally, once again, this is not a suicide mission. It could very well end up in my death, but this is a protest. And it's a protest that I hope will allow me to survive. So please don't think of me as someone on a suicide mission, even though that's how it might end up. And if that's it, then so be it. I've made the decision. I'm not going to become a petty thief. I'm a part of a government which claims that it's American when in fact it's something very different. Okay, so last time we looked at George Herbert Walker Bush and William Jefferson Clinton. Today I want to focus solely on George Walker Bush. He was elected in 2001 and served for 2 terms. He left office in 2009. It's interesting to note that Mr. Trump and George Bush were both born in the same year. In fact, Donald Trump is 1 year older than George W. Bush. Donald Trump has criticized George Bush, and I'm glad he has. That kind of puts him outside of the Republican Party. He has now been embraced by the Republican Party because of his popularity, not so much against the broad general American public, but insofar as the intensity of his followers. And that intensity is important. Um, it's been called anger, and it's channeled anger, and it's channeled through Donald Trump. If Donald Trump can do some of the things that he says he wants to do, then probably he can at least put a lid on the spoil system to some extent, at least maybe stop some of the warring overseas. Um, I don't think, actually, I don't think he's going to change the spoil system at all. He understands it well. He knows how to work with it because he's used the spoil system to benefit himself and his own commercial empire. But he seems, because he does understand it, he has the potential to deal with it and actually reduce it. I mean, he says that he wants to return power to the states. That is cool. I mean, that's one very good way to limit what is going on in Washington today. So I applaud him for that. He's all in favor of Social Security. I've never heard him make a statement about social welfare, but he seems to be taking up kind of the same notion that George Bush brought with him into office, and that he's the compassionate conservative, which means that he's kind of in the center. It sounds to me like he wants to keep the welfare programs in place. I myself am receiving a very small check, something like $290 in Social Security. But I'm taking that, and I'm taking it willingly, and I don't see this putting me as a small thief, because I've actually the government has actually taxed me, and now I'm getting back some of the taxes that is taken from me. So I don't see that as a question of theft. I think that is a question of remuneration from the government from what it took from me. I'm getting some of it back, some of that which it stole. But what I'm referring to are the transfer payments, taking from one and giving to another. And it doesn't make a difference whether it's the government taking from one corporation or one of firms in a particular industry by writing regulations that favor a few more powerful firms who can pay for the lobbying efforts in Washington. And then on the other hand, there's the other kind of welfare, and that's the social welfare that, 51%, and we're back to the 50 number. Let's just say 50% of all Americans are receiving some kind of welfare. How much of that is Social Security? What proportion of that is the Social Security? I don't know. But it's just a huge number of people that are living off the government. They're eating out of the divisive government trough. Social Security needs to be reformed, obviously. There's a book here that it's a book, it's a pamphlet, it's really very small. It's written by Lawrence M. Vance, and it's called Social Insecurity. And you can download it from the internet. So I only find one thing in it that I dislike, which it seems he contradicts himself in one place. The rest of it all seems to be fairly accurate and well written. It's not really written as a pamphlet. He didn't go through it as well as he could have. What it is, it's a series of articles that he has written, and he just puts them together in a sequence. If he'd spent a little bit more time, I think he could have done a better job. But anyway, it tells you what the social insecurity system that we have today in America is about. And it's hardly an insurance program. Okay, so we have the spoil system. By the way, there's the third kind of spoils that I've already addressed, but I didn't put these in these three categories, and it's actually just come to my mind. Is you can divide the spoil system up into three parts. You've got the corporate spoil system, you've got the social spoil system, and then you have the international spoil system that I spoke about yesterday. And that is, once you have this huge army, then countries and various political groups in those countries run to Washington to try to obtain a piece of the American military. In other words, manipulation over how it's used. And that is part of the spoil system. If that huge military weren't there, if we didn't have this huge empire to watch over, um, this political competition for use of that military would be absent. I'm not saying that we should not defend America. It's just that we've slightly overextended our interests. Okay, so that's, I mean, I could protest against that alone, but I finally, I mean, I've spent all of my life in political protest of one sort or another, so protest isn't new to me. It's just that finally it's gotten to the point where the government itself, the people of the United States, want me to turn me into a petty thief. Before, I mean, it was government taking money from me. The government was the thief, and I was defending myself against the thief. But now the government and people themselves, they want me to become the thief. And you, uh, that's where I draw the line. I'm not going to do it. Just not going to do it. So Bush was brought into office in 21, and I want to talk a little bit about the 2000 presidential campaign. As I said before, Bush ran on a platform of being this compassionate conservative, which sounds to me like the way the Republican Party is today. And that is, in, in, it promotes the spoil system, and a little differently than the Democratic Party. The Democrats want more spoils for various social groups, unions, the impoverished, um, racial groups, African Americans, gay, lesbians, transvestites, um, any group that you can think of. That's what the Democrats are about. Um, and then the Republicans, they're interested in corporate spoils. They're, and I mean, look at the American agricultural industry. That is one of the largest receivers of spoils in the United States. And for this, I actually applaud um, what's his name, the senator from Texas, Ted Cruz, for having won in Iowa, despite his having spoken out against this agricultural subsidies. My problem with Ted Cruz is that he wants to make the sand bread in a country in which we have absolutely no business, um, which is bizarre. And I feel very strongly about what the United States does overseas, because if the United States is going to be the leader of the world, then what it should be doing is setting a good example. And instead, it's setting a bad example. And we ourselves are destroying our own society. In so doing, people have written a lot about war, and I've already spoken about Smedley Butler, but there's a lot of other material that has been written about war. Dan Sanchez, for example, previous employee of the Ludwig von Mises Institute, I believe he's with FEE now, Free Economic something. I don't know, FEE. Anyway, they're kind of in the same mode. They understand that the spoil system is not good. They promote morality, which is based upon the libertarian principle of do no harm to others, their property, basically the golden rule, something that the Muslim faith believes in, something that the Christian faith believes in, something that the Buddhist faith believes in, something that children believe in. The golden rule, you do unto others what you would have them do unto you. Fair is fair. This is one reason why Sharia law is actually good. And if you read the Old Testament, you'll find that Sharia law was the practice. If you do something bad to me, I am permitted through the religious process, through the system, the moral system, to do the same back to you. And we object to that today. We allow the government to stand in between. We think we're going to save the individual from his further crimes by putting him in an institution which makes him more criminal, and then release him into society, be nearly completely unreformed. Compare our judicial system with, say, that of certain countries in Europe, and I think you'll see very different results. Our legal system is really messed up, but it's all part of the spoil system. But anyway, in Saudi Arabia, for example, if I do something bad to you, then you have the right to go to, I mean, you have the right to go to court. There is a trial. And then if it is shown, if you can show that that person is the one that committed the crime, then you have the right. It doesn't have to occur. This is no compulsory sentence like there is in the United States. You have the right to demand that that person suffer the same damage that you yourself suffered. And that creates a certain amount of social equity. It relieves your grievance against the other person. Now, it's not the best solution. The best solution is that the person that offends you, that has done damage to you, does something to repair the damage. That's a negative one and a positive one. And that comes to zero. Where the other form of justice is -1, -1. You do something bad to me, I do something bad to you, and the net result is -2. So isn't 0 better than -2? But still, in either case, there is a resolution. There is peace, because both sides have now been satisfied. The one that committed the crime got his pleasure from the crime for whatever reason he committed it, and the person that was damaged by the crime has the opportunity to cause the damage back. This is feuding, right? We talk about the Kentucky hillbillies, right, and the Tennessee hillbillies, and they're in constant feuding. So it's not new to American culture. What's his name? Alexander Hamilton, probably the initiator of the spoil system in the United States, at least at the federal level, was killed by a former vice president under Thomas Jefferson. And he was killed in a feud. It was a duel. One person's pride was matched against the other person's pride, and one person thought that he was damaged in some way through words or hearsay or gossip or whatever, and Alexander Hamilton was put up. That settled the issue. This is justice, and justice is important. But who's going to enforce it, and how are they going to enforce it? This is the real issue, and this is where the American system, the American spoil system, is failing. So maybe we'll have time to talk more about that later, to make the direct connection between the spoil system and the law. But just quickly, what does the law do? The law favors the rich because they're able to buy the lawyers to prosecute the cases in their favor, whether they are criminals or not. All right, that's fair. I mean, if someone is smart and he wins in court, okay. But should he be able to hire this very expensive lawyer to put out someone who is actually innocent but doesn't have enough money to defend himself very well? The government's not doing a good job in this regard. It's not this notion of negative law. And the notion of negative law is just the opposite of positive law, and positive law is the spoil system, because you can't have positive law tell everybody what to do without having a larger government. All right, I made the connection. So let's go on. So after Bush runs on this compassionate conservative sort of thing, or while he's running, he appoints Dick Cheney as his running mate. Now, remember when Dick Cheney entered into the Washington Circle. It was under Gerald Ford, along with Donald Rumsfeld. When Donald Rumsfeld became Secretary of State, Dick Cheney became the White House Chief of Staff. And that was the former position occupied by Donald Rumsfeld. And it was this triumvirate, George Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld, which made 9/11, well, let's say the aftermath of 9/11 possible. I mean, we don't know who was behind 9/11, but what we do certainly know is that the American government took full advantage of it. And once again, I would like to remind you, have a look at Beyond Misinformation, what science says about the destruction of World Trade Center buildings 1 and 2, the World Trade Center, and 7, the Twin Towers, and Building 7, which was part of the World Trade Center. And watch some videos. Google that online and watch how Building 7 falls. And then Google a little further, Google for controlled demolition, and watch how other buildings fall that are subject to controlled demolition. And you will see an amazing similarity. It's so obvious that the building was brought down by controlled demolition. And think of this. In order for that to have occurred, the munitions had to be in the buildings while there were people actually resident in them. I mean, is that really permissible? That you can put explosives in a building while people are resident? I think of all of the safety issues that are promulgated by government in the construction industry, that would be one that would be at the top of the list. There was criminal activity. Maybe there's no law against putting munitions in a building in which people are resident. But I've not explored the issue well enough to know how that would work. But it doesn't seem very rational to me that it would be permitted, or that we as a people should want to permit it. But once again, that's telling people how to live their lives. At least people should be warned that you're now entering a building with munitions, or while they're there, munitions are now being installed, so that you're there at your own risk. Well, that's another issue. I don't want to go into that here. So Dick Cheney is George Bush's running mate. Later, during his administration, he appoints Donald Rumsfeld as his Secretary of Defense, and this is the triumvirate that wages war. And none of these people have been prosecuted for any of the warring that has occurred. So how did Bush get into office? He was appointed, in a way, by the U.S. Supreme Court. there was a problem in the election count in the state of Florida. It went to its third count, and for some reason, it was pushed up to the Supreme Court. This goes back to this 14th Amendment and the notion of incorporation. This is the central government telling the state governments how to behave. And this is not the authority of the central government. The central government should not be involved in the internal behavior of individual states. But somehow the dispute that was taking place in the state of Florida was moved up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court chose George Bush over Al Gore, who was the vice president under William Jefferson Clinton. So that's how George Bush got started. Now, on September 11th, 2001, which isn't, 1 year and 10 months, 1 year and 8 months after he was elected, the tragedy of 9/11 took place. And many Americans wept, and much of the world sympathized, and the national press and US government dissimulated. They hid evidence. They created a fictitious narrative. And the American public bought it up. Not only did the American public bought it up, but it was bought up in most of the rest of the world. It's a huge lie. And please, this is architects and engineers for 9/11 truth. I mean, these are architects and engineers. These are the people who spend their lives in the construction, the design and construction of buildings. They know something about high-rise buildings. They know what causes them to fall. And believe me, it's not an office fire. And it's not two planes crashing in to the buildings. Kerosene burns, I think it's either 600 degrees centigrade or 600 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm not a specialist in this, but it burns at that temperature. And once it's burned, and it burns very quickly, all that's left is an office fire. All of the things that have been set on fire. And no office fire in the history of high-rise, the construction of high-rise apartments has ever brought a high-rise apartment or a high-rise building down. Never. I think there was one illustration where there was some weakening on one side that caused a little structural damage. I don't remember how that was caused, but it was just so minor. And all of the floors above continue to stand, all of the floors below continue to stand. No high-rise building has ever fallen because of an office fire. And Building 7 was not even hit by a plane. And when you watch it fall, it looks exactly like a controlled demolition. The American public bought it up. Believe me, I bought it up too. From 2001 to 2007, I believed that the airplanes, I didn't even know about Building 7. I believed that the two airplanes were responsible for the destruction of the World Trade, the Twin Towers. I believed that for 7 long years. 7 long years. So believe me, I mean, America, and I was living outside and I believed. I was living in Hong Kong at the time and I believed it. And you were here, you were actually experiencing the trauma directly. So ignorance is an excuse when your government is lying. So I don't blame you directly for that. I blame you for the spoil system. Because you've been electing these public officials ever since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and you are responsible for that. But when the government lies to you in the way that it lied to you, and I should say to us, because I mean I'm still an American citizen. I've carried an American passport my whole life. I would prefer to call it a U.S. passport because it's something that's issued by the state. It's not, doesn't make me an American to be, I mean, I spoke either yesterday or the day before about my my former friend in Hong Kong, the dentist who had his wife come to the United States to have their baby born, and then returned to Hong Kong where they've remained ever since. And his daughter is now a U.S. citizen. Does that make her American? In my mind, no. I know what it's like to become a Japanese. I know what it's like to become a Hong Konger. Um, I went way out of my way to become a part of Japanese society. I didn't so much go out of my way to become a member of Hong Kong society because I never really quite liked it. But certainly I lived there long enough to know what it means to be a Hong Konger. So, okay, let's not go too far askance. The point is that the American public did buy into it. Much of the world bought into it, and the lie became reality, so to speak. And then what happened? The United States invaded Afghanistan in October. So September was the attack, and 2 months later, the United States has invaded Afghanistan. Well, what in the world does Afghanistan have to do with New York City? I mean, Afghanistan it's not a highly developed country. It's a bunch of sheep herders, very much like the Palestinians before the Israeli invasion. They had the city of Kabul. They had other cities, just like in Palestine. The Arabs and the Jews lived together in small cities, but the economy, most of the economy was agriculturally based. How are people living in Afghanistan going to bring all of this havoc to New York, to Washington, and potentially to the White House? It's just, it's an amazing finesse, because it's not a finesse at all. I was very much against the invasion of Afghanistan. Is the fact, as soon as I heard that it was going to occur, I started writing about it, and you can see it on my Mugunwa webpage under Viewpoint. And part of the reason for that was, as soon as the attack on the World Trade Center took place, I just couldn't believe what was going on. And I said, there has to be a reason for this. And so the first place I looked was Israel, because, I mean, Israel is a thorn in the Muslim back. Even if you look at a map, it's kind of like an ulcer and in the Arab, in the Muslim world. It's this little point of red, highly volatile, very violent, that reaches out very much like the American empire in the rest of the world, to create havoc in neighboring countries. And then I was fascinated as well by the development of Yasser Arafat. I followed him very closely, and probably the reason for that is because of the suicide bombings. When I was in Germany in 1974, 76, at least in 1974, I got over from 74, 75, probably as late 75, my first time away from home for a full year. At least when I say from home, away from my motherland. I was feeling really lonely, and that was after all the trouble with my family, the protest in Washington against the Vietnamese War, my own consumption of psychedelic drugs, and all of this is, I commit suicide. I asked myself, what in the world, what is life about? What is this? It's meaningless. It doesn't make any sense. It's too confusing. I want out. And so I did something based upon a Japanese tradition. And I took a knife, a really large knife, and I put it to my gut. I didn't press it, but I said, press it. and don't press it, or well, don't press it unless you can find a good reason not to. And so I just held the knife in front of me, and I said, work this through, and you're going to work through it now, and you're going to get past this point, or you're going to quit. And finally, a philosophical light came to mind. I asked myself, all right, if I'm this primitive Neanderthal that only, and believe me, that's a very bad representation of who the Neanderthals surely were, because I've learned a lot since then. But in my mind, they were these primitive beasts, right? They're only looking out for themselves. And then you go to Dostoevsky and War and Peace and other things that he wrote, what Crime and Punishment, about the psychopaths that put themselves above all and have the idea that they can do anything they want. Nothing is a criminal act that they cannot justify. And this is where Ayn Rand comes under a lot of attack, because she sometimes comes very close to this notion, and a lot of people on the left reject it. I've never read Ayn Rand. I just know what the left, the so-called left, the liberals, the socialists, those that advocate the spoil system, they're an awful lot on the right, just as there are on the left. But these advocates of socialism, when they criticize Ayn Rand, is the art of selfishness. I mean, how absurd. We live in groups where we may be individuals, but we function as social animals, and there has to be some balance. And Ayn Rand seems very extreme to the socialist liberals. But I've never read her, so I just know what the socialist liberals think about it. And I do have some notion of what she's about from a libertarian point of view. The idea of property, the idea of person, the idea that government is supposed to defend the person and his property, and the idea of the entrepreneur is that entrepreneurs, they are special people. They tend to be very intelligent. They tend to be very industrious. That they want to do that will kind of put them out front, and they know that they're providing something good for others, and they know that they can make a profit for it and make themselves just a little bit better. And this is competition. I mean, this is what the market system is all about. And this is what socialism destroys. And compare what life was like in the Soviet Union. Compare what life was like in China under the socialist regimes. Socialism is a dead end. It's not the direction in which we should be going. So I don't want to go too far off. I always want to return to where we're supposed to be. But the American public bought into it, and the United States, 2 months after the invasion or the destruction of the Twin Towers, the United States invaded Afghanistan. It was in 2001. Now, I want to give a little background information to this invasion. And what I want to do is look at the rationale given and the history of Afghanistan, contemporary history of Afghanistan that led up to the invasion. First of all, the rationale for going into Afghanistan was to knock out Osama bin Laden. He was the person who was blamed for the attack. We're told, I don't know if it's true, that he even claimed responsibility for the attack. Well, if he did claim responsibility for the attack, then it was probably just to make himself look better. I hardly believe that he was responsible for it. And he did have a lot of money, but he was living in Afghanistan. I just read about 9/11, please, if you haven't already, because we were just terribly lied to. And anyway, we brought it up that Osama bin Laden was the person responsible for it. And he had a history of aggression against the United States, so it all fit into a neat narrative. And the rationale for going into Afghanistan was to put out Osama bin Laden. We'll talk about this later. Now let's look at the prelude. What brought us to the war, to the invasion of Afghanistan? First of all, the Soviet Union, this is part of the Cold War setting. And remember, what is the Cold War about? It's not so much about free markets and socialism. What it's more about is who is going to control the spoils of the individual states in which the Soviet bloc and the so-called free world are competing to control. I really come down hard on the free world. And the reason I come down hard on the free world is because of the direction in where we're going, not so much the direction from which we have come. I mean, the direction from which we have come was a whole lot better than where we are today. And there's one more point here that should be brought out is the difference between the British system and the American system. In Great Britain, you had the right to elect officials, but the government was sovereign, not the people. Whatever Parliament says in Great Britain, the people do. And the people don't have the right to depose the British government. They have the right to change the officials, but they don't have the right to go against any decree or law passed by the British Parliament. They don't have the same mentality that we do. The British system grew up as a compromise between the king and the aristocracy. The people weren't even involved. I mean, that's what the Magna Carta was about. And there was some incident that came before that even. But basically the British system, it's there's a king, there's a queen, there's parliament, there's the aristocracy, the House of Lords, and then there's the House of Commons. The House of Lords, they're aristocrats. These are the people that worked with the king for this compromise that said that the king had to listen to what the aristocracy wants, and there was compromise. And if he didn't bow to certain demands, then he would not be to reign. But it was never the idea that the people are the ones that create the government, and that the government has no rights that the people themselves don't have. You can't be sovereign and allow the government to engage in activity that you yourself would not be able to engage in. That is what America is about. And that's how we are different from the British, is that in the United States, the people are sovereign. In theory, at least that's the way it was in reality at one time. I mean, people will argue, yeah, well, all of the people that participated in the Constitutional Convention were lawyers and wealthy merchants, and that the people weren't really involved. But look at the ratification process. It's the people that decided whether or not they wanted to participate in this new constitutional government. The people of Great Britain have never had a choice in that regard. They've never been able to decide whether they want the government or don't. They've only been able to decide upon half of their Congress. And it's very similar in Hong Kong, only worse. We're allowed to protest, and if the king wishes to acknowledge our protest, he will. If he doesn't wish, he won't. We've just gone way beyond where we should ever have been. It's sad, America, and we need to correct it. So the rationale behind the attack was to go after one individual, a renegade. So you're going to go in and destroy a whole country in order to chase down one criminal? There's something very wrong with this mentality. So the prelude. The Soviet Union, part of the Cold War, invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And the purpose of the invasion, well, one of the reasons given was that a Marxist had obtained power in Afghanistan. He was the political leader. The government was basically socialist. And that made it a friend of the Soviet Union. But it was under attack by a lot of other people. Now, think of how Afghanistan, what the structure of the country was like. It, I, maybe a constitutional democracy like Iran. What it was on paper, I'm not really sure, but in reality, it was pretty much run by warlords, the heads of particular tribes that were responsible for governing their own tribe, and then they're coming together in Kabul um, to determine what would happen in Afghanistan as a whole. The degree that function, the amount of power that Kabul had over the rest of the nation, I'm not really sure, but I think it was fairly weak. It was the warlords that really ran the country. So there was a lot of trouble, but socialists came to power. The warlords objected, and the Soviet Union came in to support the socialists. Were there not other reasons for the Soviet Union to come in and aid the socialists? Something like minerals. And Afghanistan, if you read the book by Zbigniew Brzezinski called The Grand Chess Game, he wrote it in 1997, much later than when these events occurred. But if you see in that, he makes the claim that Afghanistan is a very important strategic element in the grand chess game, which is supported by the US spoil system. And this grand chess game says that Afghanistan strategically is right in the middle. I mean, think of who surrounds Afghanistan. In the north, you have Russia. At that time, it was the Soviet Union. To the east, you had communist China. And to the south, you had India. I mean, the populations of those countries, the population of the Soviet Union was approximately equal to the population of the United States. The population of India, how big it is, but it's certainly very, very large. And then the population of China, which I don't even want to begin to count, like 5 times the rest of the world. And these are all powers that are growing. And Central Asia is right there. And then to the west, who is to the west? To the west is Iran. And we had just gone through this fiasco under the Carter administration over the Iranian hostages. And that was brought up by our involvement in the Iranian government in 1960, 63, 53. So Afghanistan was a strategic prize for the United States, because if the United States could have that strategic prize, then it could manipulate all of the little countries that surrounded Afghanistan and influence the larger countries of then the Soviet Union, China, and India. So another colonial outpost. Just like Israel is the colonial outpost in the heart of the Arab world, Afghanistan is the colonial outpost in every other part of the world except for the Americas and Africa. It's just right there in the middle of the Soviet Union, China, and India. Strategic from the point of view of an empire. And if you buy into the empire game, the imperial game, then you might as well just stop listening to me, because I'm wasting my breath. Um, so what happened after the Soviet Union invaded the Mujahideen objected, and the Mujahideen were basically Muslims. They resented, and this is very different from the rest of the world. If you not the rest of the world, but say the Near East. In the Near East, there was the Soviet influence. The Baathists in Iraq, the Baathists in Syria, and um, eventually Egypt uh, as well. There are no Baathists in Egypt, but they were sympathetic with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union stood up to the American empire, the growing American empire. We weren't quite a global empire yet, but we were certainly moving in that direction. And they saw American influence as colonial. And here there was an opportunity to defend themselves by allying with the Soviet Union. But Afghanistan was different. Afghanistan didn't have this socialist mentality that the Baathists in Iraq had, the Baathists in Syria had, and whoever was pro-socialist in Egypt. I don't know the history. I don't know how that occurred in Egypt, but certainly it wasn't just in Egypt. It was in the eastern part as well. In Sudan, for example, Ethiopia. To what extent it was socialist, I'm not really sure. That I believe that there was definitely a socialist influence there, because these were part of the Italian. Um, they were once Italian colonies, which is Western colonialization. So Afghanistan was different. And it wasn't it was the Mujahideen. Where, by the way, think of Mujahideen. The way it's often written in the English literature is a little different. But you have Mu, and Mu means a person that practices something. Like we have the idea of baking, and who does the baking? He's called a baker. Well, this is what Mu at the beginning of an Arabic word means. It means the person who does the thing. And then jihad. Well, what is jihad? Jihad is fighting. Now, it's not necessarily fighting against someone else. It's a struggle within. You could say what I'm doing right now is jihad, because I have a principle that I want to defend, and I'm struggling inside through starvation to make sure that principle is preserved, not only for me, but for others. Now, I'm not attacking others to enforce my principle, to enforce my will on them, but I'm certainly appealing to their good sense, to their own morality, to try to get them to see my position and help me to help them. That's my goal. That's my argument. And I think it's quite sound. It's not irrational at all. Oh, and this reminds me, I didn't finish the little anecdote on Yasser Arafat. I kind of got caught up in my own suicide attempt in Germany. And that is because I had experienced this notion of suicide and was able to overcome it by making the decision that, no, I am not this independent person who can do whatever he wants. I'm a member of humanity, and humanity must have rules. And therefore, I must realize that I, as a human being, could not live without humanity, and therefore I am very closely tied to it. So if I'm going to eliminate myself, if I don't eliminate myself, I have a choice. I can either go out, steal and rob, hurt, maim, harm to get what I want. Then I'm not caught. I'm independent, I'm free, I'm a psychopath. I can do whatever I want. That was the one side. The other side was to kowtow to moral beliefs and say that there is something to morality. It's indeed what makes society function. It's what gives society its social order. It's not the state coming down and say, you must do this, you must do that, you must behave in this certain way, you must speak in this certain way. No. It's the way we're brought up in our families and in our communities. It's the way we get along. It's the way we establish and maintain social order. And okay, if I'm going to accept being this moral being, then behave like a moral human being, and you can't behave like the psychopath. It was a very important decision for me. It took me out of this notion of this homo economicus that only thinks of himself, but someone who actually functions in society in an intelligent and moral way. And that was an important foundation stone in my own philosophy. But because of that experience, when I started reading about these terrorist reports, the suicide bombings, I took an interest in it, what suicide is about. You come to a certain point, and then you have to make a crucial decision. And once that decision is made, then you want to act on it, if you're the kind of ambitious person that I have always been. And the suicide bomber was intriguing because on the one hand, he sacrifices himself, but he doesn't sacrifice himself alone. He also destroys his perceived enemy. And he's different from a combat soldier in that the combat soldier does everything he can to preserve himself while destroying the enemy. There are these people that are willing to destroy themselves for their own belief, for their own principle, while destroying the enemy. In my mind, that put them above, because the soldier is out there to kill others and preserve his own life, where the suicide bomber is willing to sacrifice his life in addition to destroying the enemy. Then there is the point, of course, that who are they destroying? Are they destroying somebody else with arms, or are they destroying citizenry? And of course, they're destroying citizenry, people that are unarmed. Now, Americans and most of the Western world, and especially the Israelis, would have it that these citizens are innocent. But now think, what is democracy? Democracy in principle, at least Republican democracy in principle, and if you go back to the founding fathers and go back to the French Enlightenment, it's about the individual taking responsibility for his own government. All right, so the people that are responsible for driving 600,000 people, and once again, remember, they are not the people at this time. What they are is a group of tribes. They are Arabs. The Arabs out, you could say the Palestinian Arabs, you think this is Palestinian nation. There is no Palestinian nation. They're living under a British protectorate as separate tribes, just like the Jews. Bunch of tribes living together peacefully, harmoniously. It's just baffling that we believe what we do today. The Israeli propaganda machine is just so strong, so foolish. And have been that way for a very long time. The point is that citizens are not theoretically, because they're the ones that are responsible for the government, and the government is responsible for the crimes, for the aggression against other peoples. Think about it. Whether you hold an arm or whether you hold a ballot. Kind of close. So I've written about that on my website, Mugunwa Viewpoint. It was fascinating to me. And because of that experience, and the invasion in, and especially the tragedy of 9/11, as soon as the tragedy of 9/11 took place, I immediately went to the internet and I said, the Israelis, they're the ones who are behind this, surely. Um, I don't necessarily believe that right now. They could have participated in it. Likely they did in some way. They could have been behind it, or they could have just been a participant and somebody else was behind it. There are a lot of different reasons um, that are given on the internet. There's this thing called the Hammer Fund. If you have a chance, Google Hammer Fund. Um, it's a very long video. It's quite well done, but it considers the people that were involved, I should say not involved, but were resident in building number 1, building number 2, and very crucially, building number 7. And the Hammer Fund, basically to give you a preview, was created to take over the commercial, I don't want to say take over necessarily, but let's say control or the recovery of what was left of the Soviet Union, namely Russia and the various states that were now either separate or part of the Russian Federation as opposed to the Soviet Union. They were influential in this recovery. And it kind of looks like they did just the opposite. What they did, they went in and exploited, and they didn't really lead or add to the recovery at all. It was despite them that the recovery took place, not because of them. But that's a whole very big, whole very big another story. It's a whole another story which is very big, and I don't have the time to get into it there. But if it is true, then the people responsible for 9/11 were some very wealthy Americans who had very good buddies in very high and important places in the U.S. government. And one really important thing that you should see if you've not seen it yet is the interview, the testimony of, I don't remember his first name, but I believe his last name is Mineta. He was the Secretary of Transportation, I believe. And he was with Dick Cheney when the plane or missile, it's not really certain, crashed into the Pentagon. And Dick Cheney, he recounts in his testimony that an officer, a low-grade officer, came to Dick Cheney and asked on several occasions, explained to the vice president that something was 15 miles out, something was 10 miles out, something was 6 miles out, or some many minutes. I don't remember the exact conversation, but he was warning the vice president that something very bad was going to happen, and the vice president knew about it. And watch that interview, and you will see that it looks very much as if office, not necessarily President Bush, but certainly the vice president, Dick Cheney, knew what was going on. But nothing has been done. I mean, the potential, I mean, when there is a crime, you don't hide the evidence. You don't create fictitious narratives. What you do is you try to discover who the criminals truly were. And they were not, 13 Saudis? that just cannot be true. Look at the evidence. I mean, these people could not even fly, um, let alone jet airliners. So we go back to the Mujahideen. We have this notion of jihad, and this notion of jihad is the the struggle within oneself to be good, and to the extent that that struggle is taken beyond oneself, that's a sore point in the Islamic faith, and it a contradiction, and it's something that the world needs to deal with. If the Islamic world and the Christian world are going to get along. But the Christian world has to realize that the Islamic world has a right to Islam, just as the Western world, and not necessarily all of it, has a right to. It's a phony war, the religious war. It's making profit for few individuals who are likely not even religious themselves. So the mujahideen, the people that are strong jihadists, the people that struggle, the people that fight for good. And these mujahideen saw the socialists, saw the Marxists, and because they saw these socialist Marxists as bad, they were supported by the United States government because they were fighting against America's Cold War enemy. And then the Saudis and the Pakistanis, who Pakistanis were friends of the United States, and the Saudis were friends of the United States. I mean, after King Faisal was assassinated, who went into his place was just like a puppet of the United States. King Faisal was the Saudi king that stood up to the United States and said, look, if you want our oil and we're willing to let you drill because we're benefiting from it, you've got to, you cannot support Israel because Israel is just massive. It's causing all kinds of problems. It's this cancer. It's this ulcer in the middle of the Arab world. It's your colonial outpost, and if you continue to support it, we're going to not deny you access to our oil. The Americans, the American oil companies and the Saudi government got along very well, benefiting from the corporate presence in Saudi Arabia, and so were American oil interests. I mean, this was trade. This was agreement. Both sides were benefiting. It was voluntary. I mean, think, who are the Saudis? The Saudis are the guardians of the two holiest Muslim shrines in the Muslim world. And 20% of the global population is Muslim. So the Saudis have a moral in the Muslim faith to guard those shrines and to preserve and defend the faith. And Israel was causing havoc in the Arabic world. It was imposing its own religious principles and the so-called democratic principles that were that they took with them from Europe, and in imposing them on Arab peoples. And the worst thing was the Nakba, where 600,000 Arab Palestinians, once again the tribes, were driven out, so that room was made for all of these Europeans coming from the European continent of Jewish faith. 1,000 people may not seem, I mean, that's how many people were killed during the Lincoln's War of Aggression. I mean, I'm using terms that I think are accurate. You might object in some way to their accuracy, but I've already spoken about Lincoln, and he wasn't a very good person. We've enshrined him just like we enshrine our Constitution. But the Constitution is just this little piece of paper, right? Or pieces of paper. And the Lincoln Monument is huge. More people probably have seen the Lincoln Monument or have a memory of it than they do of the US Constitution. And most of us don't even know in the Constitution. So I'm being honest, and I'm willing to have dialogue with you about these particular issues. Maybe you can teach me something that I don't know. But I'm trying to get you to see the other side, because that's the way peace is made. It's not just imposing your own will with force. People, we have a sense of justice, and it can't be one-sided. So what happened is the US, the Saudi Arabia, the Pakistanis, they supported the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen drove out the Soviets in 1989. So we're looking at a decade's worth of decades worth of Soviet presence in Afghanistan. And as soon as the Soviets were driven out, civil war ensued. Before the Soviets entered, and once the Soviets left, the warlords who were actually in charge politically were fighting again. And who won this civil war? It was the Taliban. There was the battle from 1992 to 1996, 4 years long, a struggle for Kabul, which is the ancient capital of Iran, and therefore a very important city, if only symbolic of who is going to control Afghanistan. Taliban won. Now think of this. It's a civil war. Warlords that have been living that nation. I don't know how the warlord system worked, whether they were elected or some sort of bloodline. I should think there's probably a combination of both. These people fought against one another for their own country. What's wrong with that? Plus, we were benefiting from it because this country, which is in the heart of Central Asia and is surrounded by Russia, China, India, and Iran, it now belongs in the hand of these devout Muslims. What could be wrong with that? Well, if you're an American entrepreneur who doesn't believe in competition, market competition, but prefers political competition and the spoil system, and who is going to control the US military, in what way is it going to perform, then if you're like that, then there is something wrong, because here are all of these minerals in Afghanistan, using minerals up quickly, right? And if you can just go in and take them, rather than having to buy them, rather than having to haggle with people that really don't want you coming in with big, heavy machinery digging up their land, it's a matter of patience. You work with people, you cooperate with them, you show them that what you've got is good. They don't perceive you as a colonial power vying for your resources. Rather, they see you as another country, another nation, interested in trade. So you help them develop and you encourage them. And if they don't want to do it, that's their choice. Country, show them your wealth. Let them see how it works, and let them understand that you can be Muslim and still make it work. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia, for example. As I said, I think yesterday probably, is that you've got the Saudi of the Thope and you've got the Saudi of the Jinn. And those two Saudis are in the same person, and they live side by side within the same Saudi mind. It works. They are a market society with a very Muslim culture. But it's the impatience, it's the greed, and it's the not nepotism, but corruption, the socialist corruption. It's the large wealthy people manipulating the government to do what the large wealthy people want them to do. That they want to manipulate is understandable because they want to compete. The problem is that they're competing in the wrong way. Activity, that relationship between large corporations, the heads of large corporations, or not so much the heads of the large corporations because they're the ones that actually run the corporations, but the boards of directors, these very wealthy people who call the shots, and who is going to head the corporation and who is not. It's these people that have an awful lot of influence. I mean, if you look at the Morgan family, for example, it appears very strongly that they're the ones that got us involved in World War I. Strong influence over Wilson and Mr. House, was it? I don't remember. But I think his last name was House, was a very close confidant of Woodrow Wilson, and strongly influenced by the Morgan family. And then there's the tie between the Morgans and the Rothschilds. These are the people that drug us into a war that we had no business in. I mean, the European empires have been struggling against one another for years. And when the United States was created, it was our opportunity to stay out of that struggle. That's a famous quote, or that what I just said refers to a famous quote given by George Washington. And stay out of the affairs. Stay out of the imperial affairs. Here we are, very distant. I mean, the whole Atlantic, the whole Pacific isolates us from Asian struggles. It isolates us from European struggles. Why in the world are we involved? It just does not make sense. Technologically, things have changed. Maybe we can talk about that later. The point is that technology is manipulation, and people who want power will use technology in any way they can to manipulate. And this is government telling the people what the people should do rather than the people telling the government what it can and cannot do. This is what America is about. We are the sovereigns, not the government. It's what makes us different, or what made us different. So Osama bin Laden was blamed for the attacks. And Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan at the time that 9/11 took place. And the US government demanded that the Afghani government release, that the Taliban release Osama bin Laden for trial in the United States. And the Taliban insisted that it's their country, it's in their country, and that if you want Osama bin Laden to be tried for a crime that you're accusing him of, then we prefer that trial take place in the Muslim world. We view you as an imperial aggressor, just like the United States views the Soviets as an imperial aggressor. And so here we have the Muslim world, which has been colonized by the Soviets, it's been colonized by the Europeans, and is now being colonized by us. They're saying no, can be tried, and he can be tried on a world stage. And so they offered that he would be tried by the OIC. Now, the OIC, it's called the Organization, at least in English, the Organization of the Islamic Conference. It consists of 56 Muslim nations. 56 Muslim nations. Now, do you think that 56 Muslim nations don't have some idea about what justice is? Do you think that they have no idea about how to conduct a trial? You think that they're not going to judge fairly based upon the Sharia law? I mean, they always, I mean, they're continuously taking their own people to court, trying them, and they're found guilty, hands, removing their heads as a proper form of justice. Do you think they're going to give Osama bin Laden special treatment? I mean, if he committed the crime, and I mean, I don't know to what extent the Western world would be allowed to supply evidence, but I can surely well imagine that people in the Islamic world would be asking for the United States government to provide evidence, because they would want to know if Osama bin Laden truly is responsible for 9/11 or not. Muslim nations. And the United States government said no. And not only that, but think of this. In international law, extradition, I believe it is, it's part of international law. It's the rule, and if it's not part of international law, it's certainly part of the, what was it, navigation law under the British Empire, which pretty much set the principles for international law. Extradition is a common occurrence. And it's just like states within the United States agreeing to, if a criminal is captured in one state, that he be given over to another state for trial. One political jurisdiction, another political jurisdiction. If the two political jurisdictions get along, and a criminal performs a criminal act in one and he flees to another political jurisdiction, and the two political jurisdictions are friends, then that person will be brought over to the other as a favor. It's a way of dealing with criminals. I mean, here you have 56 Muslim nations, and I'm sure that there would have been all kinds of influence to get the evidence from the Western world, especially from the United States, into those courtrooms to make sure that the trial would be fair, and that Osama bin Laden would have been brought to justice. The Taliban were willing to Osama bin Laden to a criminal justice system, the Muslim world. All the Americans had to say was, yes, we agree. They could have even negotiated that they would be present to give their side of the story. And their side of the story, it would have been interpreted from a Muslim side of the story, and certainly not all Muslim nations were against or have been against the United States or France or Germany, even Great Britain. I mean, there have been all kinds of trouble in the colonial past, but at least they would be viewing it, truly, they would be viewing it more from an anti-colonial position. There's no doubt about it. To think that they would be incompetent in trying the case and presenting the evidence and coming up with a just determination of guilt or innocence. If there was going to be any kind of bias, then the bias would have been in the sentence. It would not have been in the guilt. And that would have been the end of it. Osama bin Laden would have been declared guilty or not guilty. And if he were guilty, then who knows what would have happened. But then we could have taken that next step then. And this position about extradition is really important, because after the Taliban won Kabul in 1996, the American government refused Taliban as the rightful government of Afghanistan. The United States regards Israel as the rightful government. And Israel has done far more damage to the Arab Palestinians than then any damage that was, well, maybe that's an exaggeration, but let's just put it this way: there was a lot of damage caused by the Israelis, and the civil war was fairly fought and won by the Taliban. It's their country, but the United States refused to acknowledge them. Why they refused to acknowledge them, I do not know. But important is that the Taliban were represented United Nations in the General Assembly. They had a seat in the General Assembly. So the General Assembly is recognizing them, but the United States is not. Back at the history, why do most Americans resent the United Nations? That if you look at the history, it's because the United Nations resents to a very large part the United States. And why do they resent the United States? Because the United States has stood by while Israel has broken one resolution after the next. And the one I pointed out yesterday was the city of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be international. And the Israelis just took it for themselves. But that's only one resolution that was broken. There are many. Look it up. And so the General Assembly, the United Nations, I don't know what percentage, but a very large number of governments represented in the General Assembly resent the United States. They view the American government as hypocrites. So they speak out against it. Our press interprets it in a way that is offensive to us, and then we become aggressive towards the UN. And as I told you yesterday, George Herbert Walker Bush had the chance to reform the UN, but he went around, he circumvented it. And probably the reason that he did that is because he knew that the General Assembly would not cooperate with him in the way that he would have wanted them to cooperate, for the simple reason that the United States has been supporting this colonial outpost called Israel of the Arab world. I mean, Israel is obviously not the cause for all of these problems. Certainly oil and geopolitical interests are also very important. But Israel has played a very important role in the Middle East, in Central Asian and North African conflicts. America realizes that and stops supporting Israel. I mean, Israel is Israel, okay? Israel can take care of itself. The point here is consider the arguments against Iran right now with regard to nuclear weapons. Iran is a member of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is not. Israel has atomic bombs. It has nuclear capacity. Over and over again. There's so much evidence out there. But Israel has never signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the United States supports Israel. It's just one more contradiction. It's just one more form of hypocrisy, which we call the United States. Wow, it's just something wrong. So we don't acknowledge the Taliban government, but we demand extradition. Kind of ludicrous. If you want me to extradite someone whom you believe is a criminal, but you don't recognize me as the rightful government of my nation, why in the world should I cooperate with you? And they really made a good overture. I mean, allow Osama bin Laden to be tried by the Organization of Islamic Conference. But no, America has the power, and America will get what America wants, be it right or be it wrong. It's the American way, and wrong is everyone else's way. It's the way we think. And we come up with all these excuses about these bad people and doing all of these terrible crimes, and we are the criminals, and we create our own disasters. US invades in October 2001. And in the same year, either just a little bit before or just a little bit after, um, the Patriot Act is signed into law. Typical Congress, right? I mean, what is a patriot? A patriot is not someone who goes into somebody else's country and creates havoc. That is not a patriot. That's an imperialist. It should be called the Imperial Act. And then what happens 2 years later? We invade Iraq. Pretty much probably already understand the story of Iraq. But there are some important things that I just want to remind you of before I close. And that is that during the Iraq-Iran war, which is a struggle for oil between Iraq and Iran, which lasted for nearly a decade, 8 years, 1980 to 1988, the United States supported Saddam Hussein in this war. And while it was supporting Saddam, I mean, think 1980 to 1988, Reagan came into office in 1981. In 1989, the Iraq-Iran war during the entire Reagan administration. And it was during the Reagan administration this Iran-Contra affair came into being. And how did the Iran-Contra affair come into being? Iran saw an opportunity to obtain weapons from the United States in order to relieve the hostage crisis in Lebanon. So there we have the United States government supporting Saddam Hussein and at the same time supporting Iran. So what are we doing? We're supporting conflict between two nations. We're giving guns to both sides. Where's the principle in that? It's just people that make profit off of war, and an American Congress that benefits from the contributions given to political campaigns from the people that benefit from the war system. And then after the war in 1988, just after that, the Gulf War takes place. So Saddam Hussein thinks he has the support of the United States. He probably doesn't realize that the United States government is feeding arms to Iran. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But because he's had the support of the United States, and because Kuwait is a former British protectorate, and he's thinking like an Arab, he's not thinking that the Americans are so close. I mean, we come from different backgrounds. But anyway, he saw an opportunity to bring Kuwait back into the Arab fold. I said yesterday, Kuwait was a British protectorate. And maybe it was a nation by that time, but it formerly was just another tribe in the region under Ottoman rule. And there was a conflict, and Saddam Hussein saw an opportunity to expand his reach and took it. So that's a conflict between Kuwait and Saddam Hussein. That's not the business of the United States. Then you could go to the United Nations and say, well, the United Nations can discipline. And you have to give George Herbert Walker Bush, a little credit in this regard, is that he only attempted to throw out Saddam Hussein. He did not invade Iraq. He just pushed him out of Kuwait. So in this regard, he actually behaved reasonably, responsibly, insofar as the world community was interested in disciplining Saddam Hussein across a national border. But look at the hypocrisy. The United States goes into Kuwait to push out Saddam Hussein, but it itself invades. No, it's, America right and everybody else wrong. America does what it wants. And this is not the way to peace, and it's not going to work out in the long run. You have competitors growing, and they're going to continue to grow. And as they get bigger, they're going to speak up, and they're going to call us for what we are. And until we realize what we are, um, we'll continue to fight back. And what is that going to result in? All right, so 1991, the Gulf War is over, and what is done is a no-fly zone is declared. There are no planes that can fly over Iraq. None. Zero. No planes but planes of other people's nations with all kinds of firepower to shoot down any plane that would dare to take off and fly over the airspace of Iraq. The Iraqis can no longer fly over their own airspace. This is an act of war. Um, the Iraqis are told that they can't fly in their own airspace, and if they try to fly in their own airspace, then America or NATO will shoot down their planes. If that's not an act of war, if that's not an act of belligerency, let's put it that way, I don't know what is. So Saddam Hussein is pushed out of Kuwait, and then there's a lid put over his head with this lid for a decade. 1991 to 2003 when we invaded Iraq. And Saddam Hussein was eventually hanged by his own people, so to speak. Unending hypocrisy on the world stage. And we are the head of the world empire. It's not Washington, D.C. And we are the sovereign people, supposed to be the sovereign people. We're the ones who are responsible for what goes on in Washington. We're the ones who elect the leaders. America, we're the ones that are responsible. I turned my television off a long time. The last time I watched television was in Hong Kong. That was in 2007. I haven't watched it since. I watch pieces of it, small pieces that I'm interested in because I hear through Twitter or some other place that something is happening. So I want to see what the propaganda is and compare it with what the actual facts are. So I have some idea about the political discourse. Okay, so that's it for today. I return to Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, in a famous speech before the Virginia Congress. I'm not sure that it was called a Congress, but before the Virginia Assembly, he stated to encourage his fellow countrymen to usurp the authority of King George III on the American continent. And he said, give me liberty or give me death. Well, give me true charity and show me that you don't agree that the spoil system is correct and that you want to do something about it. Because I can be a strong voice to help us overcome and dismantle the spoil system. So give me true charity, and then I'll say goodbye. If that's what you want, it's your choice. I'm here to try to help you. In order for me to do that, I need your help. And if you're uninterested, then sayonara. That's a sad note to end on, and it's not the result that I want. So once again, I will encourage you to go to www.nudge.online, www.nudge.com. It's not com, it's online. And I hope that you go there. If you're on Twitter, read my tweets, retweet them, and help me to raise money so I can get through this difficult time. I'm not about to become a petty thief. I'm not about to succumb to the system because it's a system that I dislike It's a system that I want to correct. And if you want to help me, help yourselves. If you want to allow me to help you, to help yourselves, then let's do it and let the fight. I don't know. Certainly it has begun, but it's not near to the point where it needs to be in order to effectuate the system. All right. With that, it's a happy note. I'll say goodbye. Um, in about 1 to 2 hours, I will be starting day 6 of my fast. Evening, or if you're someplace else in the world, have a good day or a good morning wherever you are. Peace.